On the morning of July the 2nd, 1937, Amelia Earhart would depart for one of the final legs of her world record attempt to fly around the world. Her next destination was Howland Island in the Pacific Ocean, but at some point during the flight, she disappeared, and to this day, neither her nor any sign of her aircraft have ever been found. How did one of the most accomplished and celebrated aviators of their age completely vanish without trace? This is the unexplained disappearance of Amelia Earhart. At the time of her disappearance, Amelia Earhart was among the most inspirational and famous American figures of their time. She was a pioneer and a trailblazer for women in her field of aviation, having broken numerous records, such as becoming the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. Her achievements would cement a legacy that will continue to this day. In 1936, Earhart had her sights set on yet another world record. She was planning to become the first woman to fly around the world. Unfortunately, this would be the world record that would result in her mysterious disappearance, which has remained unsolved to this day. On the 17th of March 1937, Earhart prepared to make her first attempt at the round world record-breaking flight, but it was beset with problems from the start. During the first leg of her flight, they suffered a crash that severely damaged the aircraft, and due to persistent problems with the propellers, the aircraft was taken to Luke Field at Pearl Harbor for servicing. It was 3 days until the flight could resume. Earhart was planning to fly to Howland Island, a small island in the Pacific, but her plane never left the runway. During takeoff, there was an uncontrolled ground loop. The forward landing gear collapsed, both propellers hit the ground, and the plane skidded on its belly. The cause of the crash was never known, but the aircraft was so badly damaged that the attempt had to be abandoned until later in the year. Following the disastrous first attempt, Amelia Earhart departed Miami on the 1st of June 1937, along with her navigator Fred Noonan, for her second attempt at flying around the world. This time she flew in the opposite direction, flying from west to east. The flight had been uneventful, and by the 29th of June, she had completed 22,000 miles of her 29,000 mile round trip. The last 7,000 miles would take her from Lae, Papua New Guinea, and over the Pacific Ocean. Her next destination was Howland Island. In Lae, Earhart contracted dysentery that lasted for days. While she recuperated, several necessary adjustments were made to the plane. Extra amounts of fuel were stowed on board, and Earhart and Noonan put together an elaborate plan with several contingencies for this part of the flight. Celestial navigation will be used to track their routes and keep them on course. But in case of overcast skies, they had radio communication with the US Coast Guard vessel Itasca, which was stationed off Howland Island. The Itasca was to communicate with Earhart's aircraft via radio and transmit a homing signal to help Earhart locate Howland Island. They would use radio direction finding and the ship's boilers to create a dark column of smoke that could be seen over the horizon. Howland Island was the same destination she was scheduled to stop at during her first attempt at the world record, when her plane mysteriously crashed on the runway, forcing her to abandon the flight. Whether the attempts that occurred during that first attempt at the world record were ironic or prophetic is debated, but what happened next would become one of the most well-researched and unsettling disappearances in history. Earhart and Noonan took off from Leh on the 2nd of July 1937 at 10 AM local time and headed for Howland Islands. The flight was expected to be around 20 hours, and they expected to arrive at Howland the following morning. The aircraft departed Leh with about 1,100 gallons of fuel. At around 3 PM Leh time, Earhart reported her altitude as 10,000 feet, but they would reduce altitude due to thick clouds. But she didn't sound concerned. Her voice was calm, clear, and composed. At around 5 PM, Earhart reported her altitude as 7,000 feet. The first calls received from Earhart were at 2:45 AM and just before 5 AM on July the 2nd. There were routine reports stating that the weather was cloudy and overcast. These calls were broken up by static. The only part of the message they could understand was cloudy, weather cloudy. The first signs of a problem occurred at 6:14 AM, when Earhart radioed Itasca stating that she was within 200 miles of the ship's location and requested that the ship use its direction finder to provide a bearing for the aircraft. Earhart began whistling into the microphone to provide a continuous signal for the ship's crew to use. At this point, the radio operators on Itasca realized that their RDF system could not tune into the aircraft's signal. Earhart called again, just over half an hour later, at 6:45 AM, asking the ship to provide a bearing for her aircraft. She estimated they were 100 miles away. At 7:20 AM, Earhart reported her position on a course at 20 miles southwest of the Nukumanu Islands. At 7:42 AM, the Itasca picked up this message from Earhart. "We must be on you, but we cannot see you. Fuel is running low. Been unable to reach you by radio. We are flying at 1,000 feet." The ship replied, but there was no indication that Earhart heard this. In her transmission at 7:58 AM, Earhart said she could not hear Itasca and asked them to send voice signals so she could try to take a radio bearing. Itasca reported this signal as the loudest possible signal, indicating Earhart and Noonan were in the immediate area. The ship could not send voice at the frequency she asked for, so they sent Morse code signals instead. Earhart acknowledged receiving these, but said she was unable to determine their direction. The Itasca responded by creating a large beacon of black smoke and ordered all ships in the area to switch on all their lights to help Earhart and Noonan find their bearings. Amelia's last message came in at 8:43 AM. She sounded frantic and desperate. She indicated they were flying along a line of position towards Howland Island. After that, all contact was lost. Approximately 1 hour after Earhart's last recorded message, Itasca undertook an unsuccessful search north and west of Howland Island, based on initial assumptions about transmissions from the aircraft. The plane was believed to have gone down some 100 miles from the island, and an extensive search was undertaken, the US Navy joined the search under the orders of President Franklin Roosevelt. Official search efforts last until the 19th of July, 1937. At $4 million, the air and sea search by the combined US Naval and Coast Guard forces was the costliest and most intensive in US history, and covered over 250 square miles of ocean. Despite the unprecedented search, no physical evidence of Earhart, Noonan, or her plane was ever found. Finally, the pair were declared lost at sea, and on July the 5th, 1939, Earhart was declared legally dead. What makes the disappearance so perplexing is that in spite of all the contingencies put in place, and there being a relatively small vicinity in which the plane could have crashed, there has never been any trace of Amelia Earhart, her co-pilot, or the plane. The nature of her vanishing bears eerie parallels to the disappearances reported in the Bermuda Triangle. It's a remarkable coincidence that the leg of the journey in which she vanished was her flight to Howland Island. This was the same destination for her first attempt, when her plane mysteriously crashed on the runway without ever taking off. She was also sick with dysentery prior to starting her second attempt to fly to Howland Island. When there are so many factors that seem set on trying to prevent her from attempting that flight, it's easy to understand why some believe that there may have been some unknown force trying to prevent her or protect her from making this journey. It was 1944, 3 years after the attack at Pearl Harbor and America's entry into the Second World War. American forces had captured the Marshall Islands from the Japanese, and Admiral Edgar Cruz was conducting a routine interrogation of a captured Japanese prisoner. What the prisoner told him would shed brand new light on the disappearance of Amelia Earhart. According to the prisoner, 2 American aviators, a man and a woman, were captured by the Japanese in 1937, the year Amelia Earhart disappeared, and brought the two to the Marshall Islands. They were suspected as being spies for the American government, and were transferred to the island of Saipan shortly afterwards, where they were tortured. Within months, the woman had died of dysentery, and her male companion, now of no further use to his captors, was executed. This theory was strengthened in 1964, when 2 former US Marines publicly announced they had recovered the remains of Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan from unmarked graves in Saipan, and had transferred them back to the United States for burial. The US Marine Corps have never confirmed nor denied these reports. This has led to theories that Amelia Earhart's round-the-world attempt was a cover-up for efforts to fly over and observe Japanese fortifications in the Pacific. The problem with this theory is that this had all taken place prior to the commencement of the Second World War, and 4 years before the attack on Pearl Harbor. It's difficult to imagine why America would risk a serious diplomatic incident with an act as provocative as sending undercover spies to their Pacific neighbours. Some have suggested that Earhart didn't die on Saipan after her capture, but was released and repatriated to the United States under an assumed name. It's been argued that a New Jersey woman named Irene Bolam was in fact Earhart. Bolam herself rigorously denied these claims, calling them a poorly documented hoax, and there has been no evidence to support this. But the rumours persisted long after her death in 1982. In 1989, an organisation called the International Group for Historical Aircraft Recovery, otherwise known as TIGA, theorised that when Amelia Earhart wasn't able to locate Howland Island, she made an emergency landing on Nikumaroro, then called Gardner Island. According to this theory, Amelia Earhart and Noonan were marooned on this island and eventually died there. US planes flew over the island on the 9th of July 1937, a week after Earhart's disappearance, and reported seeing signs of recent habitation. This was despite no one having lived there since 1892. Nonetheless, the island wasn't explored at the time. Proponents of this theory point to the discovery of a woman's shoe, a sextant box, and human bones discovered on the island. The bones themselves have become a point of contention. When they were discovered in 1940, they were concluded to have come from a man. The bones were then lost. But when TIGA analysed their measurements, they concluded they most likely belonged to a woman. But it's impossible to be sure one way or the other without the physical bones available for analysis. But the biggest problem with this theory is that if the aircraft landed safely on the island, why has no wreckage of the plane ever been found? It was concluded by the US government that Earhart's plane simply ran out of fuel and crashed into the ocean. Lawrence Safford concluded the flight had suffered from poor planning and worse execution, and accounts at the time seemed to suggest that Earhart's Electra was not fully fueled at Lae, in addition to which there were a number of modifications made to Earhart's plane that seemed to hinder rather than help the flight. Noonan had earlier written about problems affecting the accuracy of radio detection finding in navigation, and the plane had recently been fitted with a new direction finding system that Earhart was not familiar with and had very little training in using. It's possible that all these factors combined resulted in a flight that was doomed from the start. However, this still doesn't explain what caused Amelia Earhart and her plane to vanish, and why to this day no trace of her or her plane has ever been found. Despite the largest naval search and rescue operation of its day, and an interest that continues to the present, there has never been any conclusive evidence of what happened to Amelia Earhart. And until she or the wreck of the plane is discovered, the strange disappearance of Amelia Earhart is likely to remain unexplained. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to like, share and subscribe. It makes such a difference to small channels like these. And if you've made it this far, thank you very much for listening.